Tonight on Free Minds TV, we'll be telling you how, well, National Opt-Out Day turned out to be mostly a flop. And we'll also be getting into some things that people in Afghanistan don't know. All that coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Welcome to a special edition of Free Minds TV where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. It is episode 183, and as always, it is Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Nick, we have a lot to get into. We are going to be only focusing in on a couple of different stories this week because we wanted to have time to really talk about them. Normally, we bring up a lot of different stories, and sometimes that just doesn't give the time they deserve. And we are talking about two very important issues, as you mentioned in the opening, National Opt-Out Day. We're talking about the TSA and protesting the full body scanners and the invasive pat-downs.
We're not protesting the full body scanners.
Yeah, we'll be getting into that. We'll also be talking about Afghanistan, the war going on in Afghanistan. I think it would relate heavily to Iraq as well. But a recent poll that was done there, asking the people of Afghanistan a series of different questions about what 9/11 is, why they think the U.S. troops are there. Some really staggering numbers here that just goes to show what the PR, the United States PR, is doing over there. And let me say, it's not doing very well, to say the very least. Exactly. We'll be getting into that story. But first, I do want to focus in on the TSA because it is the National Opt-Out Day is, or was supposed to be going on as we record this show. Unfortunately, well, it didn't go so well. Before we get into that story, though, Nick,
a whole bunch of protesters must have missed the memo.
Or they're protesting in a different way by not getting it on the airplanes. But
that's not really very visible. That's a terrible way to protest.
That's how I'd protest.
People will think you just prefer to drive.
Anyways, before we do get into that, I did want to mention, if you haven't seen us in the last couple of weeks, that's because we have had some technical difficulties on the show with audio issues and syncing and, technical stuff. So we have been recording shows.
Technical difficulties.
Technical difficulties.
It's technical.
You might have caught them on the internet, but some of them we didn't get them out to all the stations because they just, stuff wasn't airable for TV. But hopefully, we've fixed the problems. We're doing a different type of show, live to tape, no editing afterwards, so we are filming this live. So hopefully, errors, technical difficulties, all done. All right, that being said, Nick.
We'll probably make a lot more gaffes, though.
Sure.
Because now it's live. And those of you who remember when the show was live, well, it happens.
Yeah,
when the show's live, you can't say, well, that was awful. Let's do that again. So it'll go on the tape, every little thing we say. Makes it more fun for us, though.
Anyways, that being said, let's talk about it, Nick, because today, the 24th, when we're recording the show, the 24th of November, 2010, was supposed to be the heaviest travel day of the year, number one. And
well, that may be true. It may turn out to be the heaviest travel day of the year.
But on the heaviest travel day of the year, one thing that was supposed to happen were thousands of people were supposed to say, no, I don't want to have a naked x-ray of myself, a picture taken for TSA people to see before I get onto an airplane. And there's still a few more hours left in the day here as we're recording this late afternoon. But so far, it looks like not many people wanted to protest and just walked right through the body scanners.
Well, a lot of people, just regular travelers, had places to go. I mean, one of the biggest things that people worry about, especially on the heaviest travel day of the year when they're trying to get somewhere for Thanksgiving, is they just want to make their flight. So is it best to pick the heaviest travel day of the year for National Opt-Out Day? Well, some people were arguing that since it was going to be the heaviest travel day of the year, people opting out would have more of an impact, and you really wouldn't need that many people to refuse the scanners to actually cause a disruption. And if a protest doesn't cause a disruption, well, it's not very effective, to be honest. It might be very polite, it might be very well-mannered, but usually protests are more effective if they actually make a scene or cause planes to be late, or something like that. If you look at most of the effective mass protests from the 1960s, and some of them got out of hand, they didn't all stay 100% peaceful, but even the peaceful ones were disruptive. People did block traffic. It did cause streets to get shut down. That's because protest that doesn't disturb anything doesn't really do anything. If you go off into the corner of a field somewhere and have even 500,000 people hold signs, Nobody cares because it doesn't do anything.
Well, what this
you can
protest,
blow as much hot air as
sure.
you want, but it doesn't mean anything.
Sure, I know people have places to go, but what this protest was supposed to be is people say, no, I don't want to go through the invasive procedure, and instead you're just going to pat me down. And most people don't want to have these invasive pat downs because they are very invasive.
Well, most people find the pat downs worse than the scanner.
Right.
So the idea of opting out of the scanner to have somebody touch your private parts probably wasn't too appealing to
most people would rather have people look at their private parts, I guess. I think that
Is it digitized? I guess if it's digits,
sure.
pixels is better.
I thought one thing that would be interesting for people who are going through these scanners would be to wear some of the new protest wear. Yes, you might be going through the X-ray machine, but what about wearing one of the T-shirts that has metallic paint on it, something to the effect of a Fourth Amendment or stop looking at me, pervert TSA person, or something along those lines? Because if you just wrote with metallic paint on top of any kind of a T-shirt or underwear, you could even block out your genitalia, block out your breasts with metallic paint or tinfoil.
Of course, then you might get the pat down.
Sure.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, you might cause a ruckus, but at least if everybody did that went through, like Fourth Amendment, remember the Fourth Amendment, or something like that, or blocked out their nipples or something when they're going through these scanner machines, maybe it would send another message. So I think that might say you really don't want to be touched, you really have somewhere to go. Maybe that's not a bad way to protest. Personally, Nick, I don't think I'm going to be flying unless it's 100% necessary, because I don't want to go through the scanner machines, not necessarily because I care about the TSA people seeing me naked. To me, whatever. But more because I don't know about the long-term health effects of this. I don't know the science behind it. I don't think there is science behind it yet because it's not going to be years down the line. So that's my reason I don't want to go through the machines. I also not particularly fond of the idea of a TSA worker sticking their hands down my pants or any sketchy pat-down procedures like that either.
Unfortunately, though, it looks like they are going to be able to implement this without causing too much of a stir. It looks like
people
most people
grumbled a lot. There was definitely a lot of grumbling
people will
going
grumble,
on.
but understandably, it's a lot easier to grumble about something than it is to do something constructive that would actually make a difference about it. Because if you do refuse to search, well, either you have to let people touch you, which, if you're trying to make a point, I mean, I guess it depends on you personally. Some people don't really think it's that big of a deal to be touched, but they don't like it because of the privacy concerns. And where this is going, it seems, is that it's been very easy to implement it in airports in the United States. It seems very likely to me that you'll see this kind of technology expand to other places.
Yeah, subways, bus terminals.
Right,
I mean, there's been a talk not too far down the line, probably 5-10 years, where you might have a roving backscatter machine that drives along, stops outside a busy bar. Well, randomly, people are selected to walk through it.
They do have roving backscatter machines.
Sure.
It'll be interesting to see. I mean, the courts, I think, are more likely to put a restriction on it, at least at this point.
But Nick,
but all it will take is one terrorist attack.
Because you choose to go to the airport, is that the argument here? It's not a violation of the Fourth Amendment because you're making a choice to go to the airport?
See, the government, the courts and the government case is going to be this. It's not a violation of the Fourth Amendment because they say it isn't. See, it doesn't violate your rights because they want to violate your rights at the airport. So it's inconvenient for them to have to pay attention to the Bill of Rights there. Now, they're not really, at this moment, it doesn't seem like they're too interested in setting up roving X-ray machines. If they are, then the courts will make that legal too.
Yeah,
the courts are essentially going to rubber stamp what they want to do.
It's nothing that's going to happen immediately, but I mean, as people get used to this, and that's happening already, Nick. I mean, it did initially seem like a week, 2 weeks ago when this was really big deal. People were complaining about it, and they still are. But more and more people are just accepting it and saying, well, it's part of the deal to fly. You get your genitals touched. You get a picture of you taken naked. That's just how it is right now. And people are just going to accept it. And then this is an everyday part of life at the airport. And then it slowly creeps out into other parts of life.
Plus, then they add new security procedures.
Sure.
And I'm sure there is a point where people, I think legitimately there are a lot of people who try to avoid the airport now.
Well, we talked before, 41 million people in 2008 alone, and this is before this heightened level of security. 2008, 41 million people skipped flying because of the TSA procedures already, and that was in 2008. Loss of $10 billion to the airline industry, surveys show. what's
makes
it going
flying
to be
a much
looking
less pleasant experience.
Right, sure. If you don't want to do it, and I mean, we've
don't
talked
have a
about the
choice.
stories
I mean,
of the people having their prosthetics breasts being taken off, or the cancer person with the TSA person groping their urine sac and popping it on them, or the little boys having their shirts taken off and then being like all touched by the TSA right in the middle of the airport, like taking off kids' clothes, like 7-year-old kids' clothes, and touching them right out in the middle of the open in the airport. I mean, we've also brought up the story of, I forget the guy's name, T something. The guy who tried to say, no, I don't want to go through the scatter machine.
John Tyner.
John Tyner.
It's in the story.
Yeah, there we go. John Tyner, who said, no, I don't want to go through the scatter machine. No, you can't touch my genitalia. I think I'm going to just leave the airport and not take this flight. They're trying to fine him with $10,000, and they'd vowed to do the same with many other people, Nick. So,
right.
I mean, we've reported on all the lunacy. We've also talked extensively about how this doesn't even do a difference, doesn't make flying safer. It's an illusion of security.
Yeah, it's not clear that the TSA really catches all that many terrorists at all. So what we're actually accomplishing here with all the money that's been spent, all the invasion of people's privacy, and it just makes it beyond, I mean, I guess there's two separate issues here, but they're connected. There is the fact that you're violating people's civil liberties, and then there's also the fact that most people find it unpleasant. Some people don't really care. There's a certain percentage of the population that doesn't mind taking off their shoes, doesn't mind going through the metal detector, doesn't mind the backscatter machine, doesn't mind the pat-downs, and probably isn't going to mind when you start with the cavity searches.
Well, that's right now, but without the cavity searches, Nick, without the cavity searches, that number is about 50%. About half of Americans say, nope, perfect amount of security at the airport. I don't mind any of that. So that's a pretty disturbing number right there. So that means they can take it a step farther and a step farther and a step farther.
Right. Well, once people get used to it, I mean, they're willing to put up with more and more, though. So I think you'll probably, once this becomes commonplace, I wouldn't be surprised to actually see those numbers go up, unfortunately.
But it's crazy, though, Nick. I still can't get my mind off the fact that, I mean, it's all smoke and mirrors. If you are a smart terrorist, you're not going to try to go through the regular part of the airport. You're talking about people who are willing to invest.
Terrorists still do attack other things besides airports.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. That's besides the point. That's a whole nother point there. But say you are trying to blow up an airplane, it's a really stupid terrorist who's going to go through and try to get on the airplane as a passenger. I mean, terrorists, if they're really invested in this, if they really believe what they're doing, especially the ones who do it for religious purposes, and that's most of the ones we're talking about with airports at least. We're not talking about eco-terrorists or animal liberation terrorists here when we're talking about protecting airports. We're talking about like the religious extremists, right? For the most part, we can agree on that.
It's important to point out that actually eco-terrorism, in terms of the number of acts, not necessarily the severity, but eco-terrorists have struck many more times in the U.S. in recent years than Islamic radicals.
Sure. Whoa, way more.
It's not like Muslims are the only people who know how to use terror as a tactic.
Right. Not to mention terrorism just doesn't happen very often anyways. I mean, there's food poisoning or lightning strikes happen way more. But let's just say this. A smart terrorist isn't going to be going through the regular airport security anyways. He's going to be investing in somehow getting himself or a friend or access to the airport so that he can just fill the baggage, fill the whole bottom of the planes with bombs, and as he loads it with bombs, I'm a crazy terrorist, throwing them on the airplane. Meanwhile, those crazy passengers are all getting naked pictures of them taken while I'm stuffing the plane with bombs down here on the tarmac. I mean...
Well, yeah, there's that, and also I don't know that I'm sure that there are terrorist groups that would like to strike inside the United States, but particularly the Islamic radical terrorist groups, the religious extremists, which most people think about when they think about a terrorist threat to the United States today, it's not really necessary for them to attack the United States. If you think about what their motivation is, well, they don't like the United States very much, many of them for religious reasons, as well as the fact that the United States was involved in foreign affairs in the Middle East for decades beforehand. And a lot of Americans, I still, as much as we've talked about blowback, people like us have talked about blowback on this show and other places, I think people prefer to believe that terrorism is just a nonsensical act that comes out of nowhere, which isn't true. It's an unjustified act, but there's not some basis. It's not that there's no foundation to it. People don't blow themselves up just because they feel like it or because there are McDonald's restaurant chains in America. People are doing this because the United States was involved or perceived to be involved in affairs in the Middle East for decades. I mean, the United States has overthrown governments, sold arms to different factions. So these things happen. And then there's also the other conspiracy theories that are popular in the Middle East, which seem somewhat credible given the things that the United States actually did do. But if you're a terrorist who doesn't like the United States very much, it's not necessary to go through all the trouble of trying to attack inside the United States. Because there are U.S. forces in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and I think there are some bases in Turkey and
plus,
and
if
Kuwait
you're looking
and
at
UAE.
look at the definition of what terrorism is, it doesn't matter if you attack us here or somewhere else. The definition of a terrorism is causing terror, making people freak out and change their everyday routines and do silly stuff. I mean, that's what the goal of terrorism is to make people do silly things like take off their shoes at the airport, go through naked backscatter machines, and have invasive body searches when they get on airplanes.
Yeah, but I think that while I'm sure that they like to keep Americans scared, keeping them scared doesn't really do too much.
Well, that's terrorizing them.
Right, but I think that the crazy behavior, the irrational behavior that they're trying to elicit through terrorism is exactly what they've gotten.
Oh, yeah.
Which is the U.S. military invading a whole bunch of countries.
Sure, it's all over the place. It's not just in our airports. I mean, it's with the amount of money that we're spending, invading other countries, racking up the national debt, putting camera systems everywhere, eroding our Fourth Amendment even more. I mean, we are falling right into the trap that they've set for us.
Right, and that's how they beat, I mean, the Mujahideen basically took down the Soviet Union, and the Mujahideen, they had U.S. backing at the time, but they basically turned into the fundamental foundation for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and they're winning. There's a very good chance that they're going to win, not because they're any better at fighting than the U.S. military. They're awful in a head-to-head confrontation with the U.S. military, but they can bankrupt us, just like they bankrupted the Soviet Union, and they're doing a damn good job of it so far. We're 10 years into this thing, and I don't think that you're going to see these groups give up anytime in the next couple of decades, if ever.
Especially, and as we get into the next article, we'll go into one of the main reasons why they won't ever give up. The information just isn't there. The PR just isn't there. But I think you're exactly right. Yeah, we do silly things like the airports and stuff, but all that silly stuff that they can laugh at us for. But the real issue here is the amount of money.
That's not going to bring the United
that'll
States
just
to its
take away our
knees.
freedom. That'll take away our civil liberties. That'll just make us a fascist state. Yeah, okay, terrorism, that's not really affecting them so much. What will bring us down, though, is the amount of money we're spending. But, Nick, I think it's important to move on here and talk about a little survey that's been done in Afghanistan, a place where a lot of Taliban fighters are, a lot of terrorism going on there, and one of the places the United States invaded after 9/11, of course. One of the reasons why these terrorists aren't going to give up is because it's going to continue on for generations and generations, because the perceived image of America is not changing. It's staying the same, and in fact, in a lot of cases, it's getting worse. This coming from the Ross Story think tank, where a new poll out there shows that 92% of Afghans never heard of the September 11th attacks in New York. 92% of them. Arguably the reason why the U.S. is occupying their country and bankrupting them.
Well, yeah. Yeah, that's clearly the reason why. I mean, there was a lag time between the U.S. Between 9/11 and Iraq, but with Afghanistan, it was like, we're going to wait till winter's over, and then we're just going to start bombing the crap out of the place.
Yet, less than 1 in 10, I should say, less than 1 in 10 even have heard of it, know what happened there. 92% don't even know what 9/11 is. Wow, that's a big number. That shows that the U.S. has been spending way too much time fighting and blowing people up and rounding up suspected terrorists than it has educating the public over there, because without public support, well, there's no chance you're going to win this war.
Especially not a counterinsurgency. You're just not going to win a counterinsurgency
It's impossible
without public support.
Because every single time you wake up on the streets, I mean, think about it. What if you were born, and this is now that it's been going on for over a decade, in a decade, people will have been born when when they were little kids, America invaded their land. And now they're 20 years old, and there's American troops and NATO troops and all these troops on the ground there.
No one really remembers.
No one really remembers why they're there, why they got there. The American people aren't really talking, oh, we're here because of terrorism. Yeah, chances are a lot of those people are going to become terrorists to get the Americans, the foreigners, off their soil. I know I would do it. If I was born into a country where, I don't know, Red China was in the streets, making sure that there were no terrorists and putting guards and taking away my rights, and yeah, I'd become an insurgent if that happened here. I think you would too, Nick. And I think that any patriotic American would as well.
Yeah, well,
what if the tables were turned?
Especially when there's no, as you're pointing out, 9 out of 10 Afghans.
More than 9 out of 10.
Right, they don't even understand the fundamental reason why the United States, that's what the U.S. government, right? If you're the U.S. government, that's the justification you're going to give. But in Afghanistan, not only, I don't know if it's a matter of the U.S. government not trying or just not being effective in conveying the message.
Either or, it doesn't make a difference.
I mean, but with Afghanistan, I mean, even if you are going to try really hard and you put together a really good PR campaign, it's going to be very difficult to get the word out. You've got people living in remote villages who don't even know what's going on in the rest of Afghanistan. I mean, we in the West think of Afghanistan as a cohesive nation. People in Afghanistan are much more likely to identify with their ethnic group, their tribe, whatever religious faction they're a part of. It's a very fractured society. You've got people who speak different languages with different ethnic origins. So it's not even, I'm sure there is some sense that they're all Afghans. They have some sense that they live in a place called Afghanistan. But there's not even a sense of a country. The invention of a nation state as a political entity is relatively new. And we're expecting people to go basically from tribal society to a 21st century nation state in the span of a decade.
Yeah,
That's
and understand all the complexities that go along with it.
And
and
we'll point out some of the
layers on
other
layers.
things they don't
Okay.
understand. Because
Yeah,
I think we're a long way from having like people understanding their government with a system of checks and balances, something that most not most, but a lot of Americans don't even get.
Right. So 92% haven't heard of 9/11, but a lot of them still understand that the reason the American troops are there because they're trying to stop Al Qaeda and terrorists. Right. A lot of them still do that, but not as many as you might think. It shows that 40%, 4 out of 10 Afghans, believe the U.S. is on their soil in order to, quote, destroy Islam or occupy Afghanistan. Nearly half the nation of Afghanistan believes the U.S. is there to destroy Islam or occupy Afghanistan.
The Taliban has a much better PR campaign than us. Well,
that's amazing.
But it makes sense, because think about it. You've got people who are Afghans on the ground. The militants on the ground are Afghans. They understand the culture, they understand the religious ideology, and they understand the language. They can speak to people in these different ethnic groups. They understand the tribal distinctions, so they're part of that society. Of course they're winning the PR campaign. Even if you take an American and you teach them Pashto, there's still a world of difference between just the viewpoints. It's like, I don't know. It'd be like talking to somebody from 1,000 years ago. That's not necessarily to be derogatory towards the Afghans, but their way of life, their whole society is so completely different than anything Americans are used to, or Europeans, other NATO countries are used to, that I think it's very difficult to actually find any kind of common ground to have a dialogue about something as complex as foreign policy. It's a daunting job to even try.
So how is America going to fix this? Well, we're going to implement democracy, right? Well, that's the plan. We're going to implement democracy. Well, what do the Afghan people think about democracy? 43% could not name one positive aspect of democracy. And nearly 2/3, 61%, said they didn't think the Afghan forces would be able to keep up the fight against the Taliban once the U.S. leaves. But nearly half, once again, Nick, nearly half the Afghan people can't name a single positive effect of democracy. Yet this is what's going to save the country. What the people don't believe in it, Nick.
Well, 60% of them might, or 60% of them might be able to name
one positive aspect. It's not like just half the country says, nah, there's more cons than pros. It's like more than half the country says there's not a single pro. Nick.
Well, yeah, but what has changed? I mean, Afghanistan, they still don't have infrastructure, really. I think the U.S. might have built a couple of roads near the capital.
They blew them up and rebuilt them and blew them up.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to build the whole thing up from scratch. It's been a war-torn society for pretty much ever. Sometimes when people talk about the Middle East in general, they tend to exaggerate. But Afghanistan, for most of its history, there's been this warlord thing going on where it's kind of part of the way of life. So it's still a war-torn country with no infrastructure. People are still dirt poor. The level of education isn't that good. Their future really isn't that bright. So what do you, I mean, I think if you're a typical Afghan, life probably hasn't gotten too much worse. It probably just hasn't changed very much. It's probably not much different than it was 10 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago. It probably wasn't that much different when the Russians were there.
Well, now the Americans are here instead. It's a different...
Before the Russians, it was the British.
Right. I mean, it's just a different bunch of foreigners occupying their country and blowing up their homes and taking away their rights. I mean, yes, there are some good things going on as well. I don't want to paint the whole picture as everything Americans are doing over there is horrible, but I mean, what would you do if the tables were turned? How would you feel if a foreign nation was occupying the U.S. because our government was dangerous or because we harbored terrorists, right? What would we do?
I throw that in there. What if they were Muslims? Because that wouldn't matter too much to me, but I think to a lot of Americans it might.
It'd be very upsetting.
Americans are supposed to be more tolerant, and in fact they are more tolerant than people in some of the Arab countries. They're probably more religiously tolerant. But think about it. A lot of Americans really don't like Islam that much.
Right.
So when you talk about, say, Red China occupying the U.S., that doesn't really do it because there's that political connotation, but there's not that religious connotation.
I don't care who it is. Whatever foreign country is occupying my hometown.
Well, but you don't care because you're not particularly religious.
Okay.
I'm saying that people in the Bible Belt, yes, they would probably resist somewhere like China occupying the U.S. They would resist a lot harder if they thought it was basically the Antichrist.
My God versus your God.
And it's gotten to the point where, we are Christians in some parts of the world are looked on as like demons.
All right,
just
Nick,
like Muslims are.
We're running out of time. A lot of problems we've discussed in the show. What are some solutions? We've got like a minute to come up with a couple solutions.
You can put the foil stuff on your clothes.
I'll put the foil stuff on my clothes when I go through the airport. Personally, I'm just not going to fly. I'm good with that. I mean, I know other people have to, but that's going to be me. As far as this Afghanistan situation goes, which could actually, if we cleared some of that up, got over our terrorism fear, figured out that it's really not a real threat compared to all the other dangers in life, like getting in a car, eating food, being struck by lightning, et cetera, et cetera. Everything else is more dangerous than terrorism, especially for the U.S. How about getting out of these countries? Stop
that would be
implementing.
The right idea.
Yeah. That's, I think, the solution.
Is there anything
stop
we can do to
imposing
make it
foreign
happen?
policy on other countries. Anyways, that's going to do it for us. We'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Until next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
freemindsmedia.org in the meantime. And, of course, join us for Free Minds TV, Radio this Sunday and every Sunday, 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a good night. We're doing it live. First time. Getting down. Yeah, there we go.